So picture this. It's the final days of 1983. A military coup has just completely ripped through Nigeria. Overnight, the entire democratic apparatus is just, well, it's dismantled.
Yeah, completely gone.
Right, and suddenly, the most powerful politicians in the country, I mean, we're talking about men who controlled international highways, massive municipal budgets, sprawling districts, they're all out of a job.
And you can probably guess what happened next.
Oh, absolutely. The immediate aftermath was completely predictable.
Mhm.
Most of these ousted leaders, they just scrambled. I mean, they desperately started lobbying the very military dictators who had just overthrown them.
Begging for appointments, yeah.
Exactly. Doing literally whatever it took to hold on to their mansions, their luxury cars, and, the vast wealth they had basically siphoned from the public treasury.
Right, the classic scramble for survival.
But this is where it gets interesting. One man reacted entirely differently. This particular local government chairman, he just packed his bags, walked away from the center of power, and went back to his home village.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. He didn't have a mansion to retreat to. He didn't have a single luxury car. He hadn't stolen a dime, to the point where he didn't even have like an independent means of financial survival.
No hidden bank accounts, no safety net.
Right. He just went back to being a part-time classroom teacher and a subsistence farmer.
Which, I mean, it is the ultimate subversion of our expectations when it comes to power. We are so conditioned, right, to believe that proximity to massive budgets just automatically results in personal enrichment.
Especially in historical eras defined by massive political instability.
Exactly. You just assume someone is either powerful and compromised or powerless and honest. So finding a figure who wielded this immense transformative administrative power, yet walked away with absolutely zero material wealth, well, it forces us to completely reevaluate what public service can actually look like.
And that is exactly the paradigm shift we are exploring today. We are doing a deep dive into the life of Chief Francis Ogar Awuna, widely known as FOA.
Yes, the pioneer chairman of the Ikom local government in Nigeria.
Right, and we're doing this deep dive specifically for a very important audience, which is the younger generation of the Ofutop and Ikom people listening right now. Because about 30 years ago, FOA passed away and was entombed in the Okosora village square.
But his legacy is anything but buried.
No, not at all. He holds this extraordinary, almost mythical chieftaincy title, which is Ntun onimono one of Ikom.
And that title, I mean, that is the key to his entire life story. Translated literally, it means the king of doing good or the king of philanthropic deeds.
We're the chief of humanitarianism of Ikom.
Right. And earning a title like that, it isn't just about, being a nice guy.
Yeah, being friendly to your neighbors.
Exactly. In the context of Nigeria from the 1950s through the early 1990s, which was a period characterized by the difficult twilight of British colonialism, a devastating civil war, fierce ethnic fracturing, and the cyclical military coups you just mentioned, earning the title of the King of Doing Good required an almost superhuman level of resilience.
And ethical fortitude. Which, honestly, I want to understand the mechanics of. How a person builds that kind of unassailable character. Because you don't just wake up one day, step into a politician's office, and decide to be incorruptible while everything around you is literally falling apart.
No, there definitely has to be a proving ground.
Right. So let's rewind the clock way back, long before he was managing budgets or international borders. We need to go back to the 1950s, when he was working in the colonial administration of eastern Nigeria.
But not as a politician.
No, as a school teacher.
And a very effective one at that. I mean, by 1955, he had rapidly risen to the position of headmaster. He spent the late 50s and most of the 60s working in places like Abaragba and Ekpokpa.
Okay, so to really grasp what FOA was dealing with on a daily basis, we kind of have to establish the physical and social geography of Ofudopland at that time, right?
Yes, absolutely. We are talking about a deeply agrarian society. The economy, the culture, the daily rhythm of life, it was all entirely dictated by farming.
But politically, it was incredibly decentralized. It was composed of 7 autonomous, fiercely Republican villages.
Right.
So when you say fiercely Republican, in this specific historical context, what did that actually look like on the ground? Because I'm assuming we aren't talking about like modern representative democracy here.
No, not at all. We are talking about a society that fundamentally rejected centralized autocratic rule.
So no king?
Exactly. There was no single overriding king dictating terms to everyone else. Each of these 7 villages administered itself internally through its own local chiefs and councils of elders.
Okay, I see.
They made decisions through consensus. They valued their independence above almost everything else. I mean, Abaragba and Ikpokpa were the largest of these settlements, but size didn't grant them dominion over the smaller villages like Okosora, which is actually where FOA was from.
Which sounds incredibly democratic on paper. But I'm trying to picture how you resolve disputes without a central authority. Like, if 2 of these independent villages have a disagreement, who makes the final call?
Well, that was the fatal flaw in the system, and it was a constant, ongoing source of friction because there was no central cartographic authority drawing, hard borders on a map.
Right, no official surveyor.
Exactly. The boundaries between these villages were conceptual and very fluid. They were often based on verbal histories or natural landmarks that could literally shift over time. And the 2 things they fought over most were the absolute lifeblood of the community.
Which were?
Farmland and fishing ponds.
Oh, wow. So if a river shifts its course after a heavy rainy season, suddenly a vital fishing pond might geographically sit closer to Village A than Village B. And because they both rely on it for survival, you just have an immediate existential crisis.
Precisely. I mean, ownership rights over a patch of fertile soil or a fishing pond weren't just matters of civic debate. They were matters of caloric survival.
Literal life and death.
Yeah. The historical record indicates that these intercommunity and intra-community disputes frequently escalated into all-out warfare. It was a highly volatile environment where a simple disagreement over a yam harvest could spark a violent generational feud.
Okay, so now inject the British colonial administration into that powder keg. You have this decentralized, fiercely independent agrarian society, and suddenly a sprawling, bureaucratic foreign empire shows up trying to impose order. I can only imagine the friction.
The friction was absolute. I mean, the colonial government fundamentally did not understand or even care to understand the nuances of a decentralized republican system.
Right, they wanted legibility.
Exactly. They wanted a society they could easily tax and police. So they introduced a barrage of foreign concepts. Tax raids, sanitary inspections, fines, levies.
And a completely alien justice system enforced by colonial police.
Yes. And Western education was part of that entire package too.
Which is where FOA comes into the picture.
Yeah.
He's a headmaster trying to advocate for literacy in a place that views the entire colonial project with intense, overwhelming consternation.
Right. Just imagine being a subsistence farmer in a foodopland in the 1950s. Your survival depends on the labor of your entire family. Every single pair of hands is needed to clear the brush, plant the tubers, harvest the crops.
Yeah.
And then a representative of this foreign government, a government that occasionally sends armed police to raid your village for taxes, mind you, tells you that you need to send your strongest children to sit inside a brick building all day to learn a foreign language and read books.
It would feel like an attack on your family's ability to eat. You would view the school not as an opportunity, but as like an extractive tool taking away your labor force.
And that is the exact tightrope FOA had to walk. Because there was a severe lack of educated human resources in the region at the time, FOA couldn't just sit in his office and grade spelling tests.
He had to get his hands dirty.
He was thrust right into the middle of this massive culture clash. He had to become the primary liaison between his people and the colonial authorities.
He was essentially functioning as a human translator interface. Kind of like someone trying to run a modern software update on 7 different, completely incompatible analog operating systems.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
He had to explain the mechanics of this new world to his community while simultaneously trying to protect them from the punitive mechanics of the colonial state.
He had to do the really hard work of social education. I mean, he had to sit down with that skeptical farmer and explain the long-term mechanics of literacy. He had to argue that having a child who could read the colonial tax documents might actually protect the family from being exploited by the tax raids in the future.
So he had to sell the concept of delayed gratification.
Yes. But it wasn't just education. Remember those fishing ponds? If a fight broke out over one of those, he couldn't just let it escalate into warfare.
Right, because if the villages went to war, the colonial police would intervene.
And their intervention usually involved mass arrests, heavy fines, and brute force, which would obviously only destabilize the community further.
Right.
So FOA had to step in preemptively. He used his position as the teacher, which is a figure of neutral authority and respect, to mediate these land and water disputes before they reached a boiling point.
He became the buffer.
Exactly. He was handling justice, health, education, and taxation issues all through the power of consensus building.
Man, I see how this becomes the crucible for his leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
He isn't dictating from a throne. He's managing competing interests through empathy and negotiation.
Exactly.
But and I'm struggling to bridge a gap here. How does a local headmaster, whose daily life involves mediating fishing pond disputes in rural Abaraga, suddenly develop a political philosophy aimed at unifying the entire African continent? I mean, that is a massive conceptual leap.
It is a leap for sure, but it's entirely rooted in the intellectual climate of the late 1950s. Nigeria was hurtling toward independence, the colonial facade was cracking,
Right.
and FOA's experience mediating between these hyper-local, squabbling villages made him acutely aware of a broader truth. Fragmentation is a weakness that outside forces will always exploit.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah, if the 7 villages of Ofatop couldn't unite, they would be crushed by the colonial police. If the tribes of Nigeria couldn't unite, they would never achieve true sovereignty.
So he takes that highly localized lesson and just scales it up to a national and even continental level.
He threw himself into the anti-colonial movement. He joined the National Council for Nigeria and the Cameroons, the NCNC, and he became a deeply committed disciple of the Zikist movement.
Working closely with Matthew Magoo, right?
Yes, working very closely with Matthew Mbu, who became his lifelong political ally. Together, they were actively organizing pro-independence activities across the entire Ogoja province.
Okay, so for those who might not know the deep history of Nigerian independence, Zikism is named after Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, correct?
Yes, the Right Honorable Nnamdi Azikiwe. He was one of the foremost towering figures of African nationalism. And Azikiwe didn't just want the British out of Nigeria. His vision was true Pan-Africanism.
He argued for the social, political, and economic integration of the entire African continent.
Exactly. He believed that Africa could only stand shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the world if it operated as a unified, enlightened bloc. FOA absorbed Azikiwe's writings, texts like The Future of Pan-Africanism, until they literally became his own worldview.
And he didn't just preach this stuff. He lived it in a way that is almost startling. I mean, when his second son, Isaac, was born on July 8, 1963, that happened to be the exact same day the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, was inaugurated.
Right.
FOA literally named his newborn son Addis Ababa after Addis Ababa, the city in Ethiopia where the OAU was headquartered.
It's incredible. It just demonstrates how deeply these political ideals permeated his personal identity. I mean, to fully grasp what FOA was trying to build, we really have to examine the Zikist philosophy he adopted. Specifically, the 5 principles of African liberation.
Because this wasn't just vague optimism, right? It was a structured approach to rebuilding a fractured society.
Exactly. It was a highly structured framework.
Okay, let's break those down because they feel incredibly relevant to understanding how he operated. What is the first principle?
The first principle is spiritual balance.
Okay.
In the Zikist context, this meant cultivating a profound empathy for other people's viewpoints. You had to fundamentally recognize their right to hold those views, even if you passionately disagreed with them.
Oh, wow. I can see a direct through line from his days as a headmaster here. You can't force a subsistence farmer to value Western education by screaming at them. You have to first validate their fear of losing their farm labor.
Yes. You have to achieve that spiritual balance before you can ever hope to persuade them.
Right. What's next?
The second principle is social regeneration. This is the active, conscious drive to expel prejudice from your own mind. It demands that a leader strip away all national, religious, racial, tribal, or economic biases.
That is a staggering challenge in a country like Nigeria, which, I mean, let's be honest, it was artificially stitched together by the British, forcing hundreds of distinct ethnic groups with different languages and religions into one borderscape.
It was incredibly difficult.
Trying to govern without tribal prejudice in that environment just goes against every political survival instinct of the time.
It really does.
Oh.
But it was essential for the third principle, which is economic determinism.
Which means what, exactly?
It's the realization that political independence is essentially an illusion if you aren't economically self-sufficient. For the Renaissance African to be truly free, they couldn't remain economically dependent on their former colonizers or rely solely on raw material extraction.
So if we translate that to FOA's reality, he's looking at his farming communities and realizing that as long as they're just barely scraping by on subsistence farming, they will always be at the mercy of whoever controls the broader economy.
Exactly. To liberate them, he has to find a way to make them economically robust.
Okay, so that's 3. What's the 4th?
The fourth principle is mental emancipation.
I like the sound of that.
It's crucial. This requires a deep knowledge of African history and accomplishments, and the absolute dismissal of the inferiority complex that the colonial system had systematically tried to instill in the local populace.
You have to actually believe you are capable of building complex institutions,
Right. And all of this culminates in the fifth principle, political resurgence.
which is the ultimate goal of regaining the sovereignty that was stolen by colonialism.
Exactly. But here's where FOA's intellectual life takes a really fascinating turn. He didn't just rely on contemporary political pamphlets. He actively sought out the foundational texts of political science.
Really, like,
He was a compulsive reader of classical Greek philosophy, specifically Plato and Aristotle, and he actively synthesized their ideas with his Zekist beliefs.
okay, stop right there. Applying ancient Athenian philosophy to a rural, newly independent West African nation in the late 1950s. I mean, how does that actually work in practice? Let's start with Plato. What is a village headmaster taking from the Republic?
From Plato, he extracted the core concept of the philosopher king.
The idea that rulers should be philosophers.
Right, the idea that anyone who wields power over a community must be wise and highly educated. Platonism argues that human suffering and societal evils are largely the result of ignorance.
Sure.
Therefore, the ideal government is one led by benevolent, educated leaders who use their intellect specifically to elevate the lives of the common people.
So, in his mind, his career as a teacher wasn't just a job. He was literally running a Platonic academy in Ophuto. He believed he was forging the educated minds that would eventually free his society from the evils of poverty and colonial subjugation. But Plato can be very theoretical. Where does Aristotle fit into this?
Well, Aristotle provided the operational ethics. Aristotelianism insists that goodness is a verb.
A verb.
Yeah, it focuses on doing good rather than merely being good. Aristotle argued that you can have all the benevolent thoughts in the world, and you can hold all the right opinions in your heart, but until you take physical action that tangibly helps another human being, your internal goodness is utterly meaningless to the world.
Action over intention.
Exactly.
It's not enough to believe in Pan-Africanism, you have to build the road. It's not enough to believe in education, you have to actually build the school.
Right. He fused Zekism, Platonism, and Aristotelianism into a singular worldview. He became a conscientious advocate for what he called a progressive humanity.
I mean, it is a stunningly beautiful intellectual framework,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a very practical problem with it.
Which is?
Philosophy seminars are great, but politics is a blood sport.
Yes, it is.
As Nigeria transitioned toward independence, they had to hold actual elections to build the new democratic structures. And an election isn't a debate about Aristotle, it's a street fight for resources.
And that collision between his high-minded ideals and the brutal reality of grassroots politics, that happened when he decided to run for the seat of the Ikom County constituency in the Eastern Nigeria Assembly in Enugu.
This was the election that would usher in the first republic of an independent Nigeria.
Yes.
Let's talk about the logistics of running a campaign in the Okosora province in the early 1960s, because just physically getting to the voters sounds like an absolute nightmare.
The physical environment was incredibly daunting. The region was characterized by dense, ancient forests. Hundreds of towns and communities were completely inaccessible by motor vehicles.
So how did you campaign?
To campaign, a candidate had to commute by small boats up winding rivers, push bicycles through muddy trails, or literally just hack their way through bush paths on foot for days at a time.
Add to that the fact that you have incredibly low literacy rates, so you can't just hand out pamphlets, and you are dealing with dozens of different dialects. How do you even communicate a unified political platform in that environment?
Well, FOA had a massive head start because he had spent the last decade walking those very bush paths as a school administrator. He had built up immense personal goodwill.
People knew him.
Yes. In almost every village, he was known simply and respectfully as the teacher. He had a reputation for fairness from all his years mediating those fishing pond disputes.
So he has the name recognition. But the political reality was that the Eastern region was essentially a one-party state dominated by the NCNC.
Right. Winning the general election was basically a formality. The real battle was the internal party primary to secure the candidacy.
And this electorate wasn't analyzing the nuances of a progressive humanity. They were voting based on something much older.
They were voting based on tribal and ethnic loyalties. Electioneering and representative democracy were brand new concepts, so in the absence of a long history of ideological debate, voters naturally defaulted to supporting the candidate from their own ethnic group.
viewing the election as a way to secure regional dominance and resources,
Exactly.
which sets up an incredible clash because FOA's primary opponent is a man named Michael Ogon. And the demographic math here is brutally simple.
It was a demographic mismatch of epic proportions. FOA hailed from Okosora, which was the smallest of the 7 Ofatop towns, and the Ofatop clan itself was a very small minority within the wider Ikom County.
Okay, so who was Ogle?
Michael Ogon was of Boki stock, and the Boki land area was the absolute largest ethnic tribe in both the county and the entire province.
So if everyone votes along tribal lines, FOA loses by a landslide before the first ballot is even cast. It's David against Goliath, but Goliath has all the votes.
Furthermore, Boki land contains some of the most remote, inaccessible terrain in the region, making it exceedingly difficult for an outsider like FOA to penetrate and try to change minds.
I really want to contrast how these two men ran their campaigns, because it perfectly illustrates the tension between FOA's philosophy and political reality. FOA rolls out a campaign slogan that is deeply rooted in his Zikist beliefs. Platform for a progressive humanity.
It's sweeping, intellectual, and visionary.
And his visual logo, because he needed a symbol so illiterate voters could identify him on the ballot, was a picture of a baby.
Which he chose to symbolize innocence, the rebirth of the nation, and the moral regeneration of society.
Right.
He was running a campaign purely on the Zikist creed and Aristotelian humanism.
Okay, I have to interject here, because while that is incredibly noble, it also seems wildly, dangerously naive.
Yeah.
I mean, he's running a campaign with a baby logo and preaching progressive humanity. Meanwhile, Michael Ogon is running a fiercely pragmatic, numbers-based campaign.
Very pragmatic.
Ogon's message was essentially, politics is a game of numbers. We are the Boki tribe. We have the demographic majority. Therefore, we win. End of discussion.
Right.
In a political landscape defined by ethnic loyalty, didn't FOA basically bring a philosophy textbook to a gunfight?
That is a very accurate assessment, and history judges it similarly. Looking back, his campaign was overtly too idealistic for the state of social awareness at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a brilliant orator, he ran a vibrant, colorful campaign, and he had the backing of intellectual heavyweights like Matthew Mambu. But he was slamming headfirst into a wall of primordial sentiments.
And when ideals hit primordial sentiments, things usually get violent.
The campaign became incredibly bitter and acrimonious. The stark contrast between FOA's pan-nationalistic anti-tribal dreams and Ogon's unapologetic ethnic pragmatism created immense friction.
This wasn't a gentlemanly debate.
Not at all. It was a hallmark example of the chaotic, often violent elections that would ultimately doom Nigeria's First Republic.
We're talking about allegations of ballot box snatching, voter intimidation, and stuffing boxes in remote communities where there was no oversight.
Exactly. The logistics alone made a clean election impossible. It took days just to receive the voting results from the hinterlands. And when the dust finally settled, the demographic math held true. Michael Ogon narrowly edged out FOA to claim the assembly seat.
So the pragmatic tribalism defeated the progressive humanity. That has to be a crushing blow to someone who believes so deeply in the intellectual evolution of his country.
It was a defeat, yes, but it achieved something vital for his trajectory. That campaign placed FOA firmly in the public glare. It established him not just as a teacher, but as a political force who absolutely refused to pander to tribalism.
It proved she had profound courage.
Yes, and he was going to need every ounce of that courage. Because the very ethnic politics that defeated him were about to tear the entire country apart.
The very things FOA warned about, the tribalism, the corruption, the lack of benevolent leadership, completely hollowed out the First Republic.
It did.
The politicians treated the national treasury like a slush fund. The democratic institutions collapsed, leading directly to a military coup in 1966.
Yeah.
And that coup catalyzed an absolute nightmare: secession and the Nigerian Civil War.
The Biafran War. And it is vital to understand the sheer scale of the trauma this conflict unleashed.
Right.
The eastern region of Nigeria declared itself the independent Republic of Biafra, and the federal government launched a massive military campaign to crush the secession. The eastern region became a theater of horrendous, unrestricted warfare.
And geographically, if you look at a map, the Ogoja province and the Ikom division were located right on the easternmost edge of the country, bordering Cameroon. They were the frontier.
Which made them a primary battleground from day one. Because of their location, the region was immediately occupied by the secessionist Biafran forces.
Okay.
Then, the federal armies attacked from the north and west, trying to push through the province to reach the Biafran heartland.
The civilian population was literally trapped in a meat grinder. The way this is documented, you have towns and communities that were captured by the Biafrans on a Monday, surrendered to the federal troops on a Wednesday, recaptured by the Biafrans on a Friday.
The front lines were a chaotic, bloody mess. It was a state of total anarchy.
Yeah.
The historical accounts of this specific region pull no punches. Life became nasty, brutish, and short. It was a matter of daily survival by any means necessary, under the constant threat of summary execution. The fighters on both sides perpetrated unimaginable war crimes against the hapless villagers.
We are talking about forced conscription of children, systematic rape, confiscation of all food supplies leading to starvation, and rampant executions of anyone suspected of being a sympathizer.
Families abandoned their generational homes and just fled into the deep forests, living like hunted animals to hide from the patrols.
In the midst of this apocalypse, FOA was forced to retreat from his broader political work and return to his native Ofudopland. And at the start of the conflict, Ofudopland was firmly under the control of the secessionist Biafran army, and they had heavily recruited, often forcibly young men, from the local clans into their ranks.
Now, put yourself in FOA's shoes. He is living under an occupying army that demands absolute loyalty to the new Republic of Biafra.
Right, but FOA's entire political philosophy, his Zekism, his Pan-Africanism, is built on the concept of a massive, united, integrated state.
Exactly. His mentor, Azikiwe, had openly denounced the secession. FOA remained fiercely committed to a united Nigeria.
Which, I mean, holding an integrationist pro-federal position while living under Biafran military occupation was practically a death sentence.
It was. And the cost of his convictions was immediate and devastating. Because FOA refused to support the rebellion, the Biafran fighters targeted his family. They executed his father-in-law, a man named Ntun Agbi.
God, I can't even begin to fathom the psychological toll of that. Your political principles directly result in the murder of your family member by the people occupying your town.
It's just horrific.
The natural human reaction would be overwhelming hatred or complete withdrawal from the world.
But FOA didn't withdraw, and he didn't succumb to blind vengeance. This is where his Aristotelian duty, the absolute requirement to take action to protect others, overrode his personal grief.
Wow.
Because of his legendary status as the teacher, the elders of the clan desperately turned to him to help salvage their land. His reputation for honesty was so profound that military commanders from both sides of the conflict would actually try to seek him out, hoping his endorsement would pacify the local population.
But the situation on the ground was devolving into a bloody stalemate.
It was.
The federal forces were trying to advance into Ofudopland to push the Biafrans out. But the federal troops were mostly from other parts of the country. They had absolutely no idea how to navigate the dense ancient forests and river systems of the region.
Meanwhile, the Biafran forces had local recruits who knew every single bush path, every hiding spot, every river crossing. This terrain advantage allowed the Biafrans to constantly ambush the federal troops, leading to this horrific back-and-forth warfare over the villages.
And every time a village changed hands, the civilians paid the price. I mean, if you cooperated with the Biafran soldiers just to keep them from burning your house down, the federal troops would massacre your village when they arrived, accusing you of treason.
Right.
If you then cooperated with the federal troops, the Biafrans would massacre you when they recaptured the town.
It was an inescapable loop of violence. FOA recognized that the only way to save his people from total annihilation was to break the stalemate and end the fighting in his region entirely.
He had to end it.
He made the calculated decision that the federal forces had to win decisively, so he undertook a mission of astronomical risk.
I want to really dig into the mechanics of this because it sounds like a movie, but it's terrifying reality. He decides to act as a scout for the federal army.
Utilizing his intricate encyclopedic knowledge of the local geography knowledge he gained from years of traveling between those autonomous villages to settle disputes. Remember,
Oh, right.
he slipped out of his village at night. He moved completely undetected behind the Biafran enemy lines. He had to navigate dense forests, evade armed patrols, and cross rivers in a war zone where being caught meant instant execution as a spy.
He sneaks all the way to towns called Ende and Nkonfab, which were located in the already liberated Ogoja area where the federal commanders were camped.
He presented himself to the federal commanders and began providing them with highly classified intelligence. He mapped out the Biafran positions, detailed their supply routes, and explained the safest directions to navigate the forest without walking into ambushes.
He essentially handed the federal army the cheat codes to the local terrain.
He did.
And the intelligence was incredibly accurate. Guided by FOA's information, the federal troop deployments were able to outmaneuver and systematically rout the secessionist forces, driving them entirely out of the Ikom and Ofudoplan territories.
From a strategic standpoint, it was a massive success. But the tragedy of this civil war is that liberation did not equate to peace.
This is the part of the story that just breaks your heart, because it exposes the darkest realities of unchecked military power. The federal forces secure the territory. Ofudoplan becomes a vital, safe supply route for federal troops pushing further into the Igbo heartlands. You would think the locals could finally breathe a sigh of relief.
Instead, they traded one oppressor for another. Once the federal soldiers were securely garrisoned in the area, they began committing the exact same horrific atrocities against the local villagers that the displaced Biafran forces had just committed.
The troops that FOA had risked his life to guide in to save his people were now victimizing them. Extortion, rampant sexual violence, summary executions of civilians over petty disputes. It became the new normal under federal occupation.
For a man driven by a profound philosophical duty to his community, watching the liberators destroy his people was completely unacceptable. The community elders once again came to FOA, begging him to intervene. He started by going to the local federal battalion commanders stationed in the area, attempting to use his influence to stop the violence.
But they ignored him. They were armed men in a war zone? They didn't care what a local school teacher had to say about human rights?
No, they did absolutely nothing to curtail the excesses of their troops. When FOA realized the local chain of command was corrupt and indifferent, he decided to escalate the issue in a way that is almost hard to comprehend.
This blew my mind. The local commanders won't listen, so FOA decides to go over their heads. But he doesn't just send a letter. He physically travels to Port Harcourt to find the man in charge of the entire federal theater of operations.
Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo.
Right.
Try to picture the logistics of this journey. We are in the middle of a brutal, chaotic civil war. The roads are destroyed or heavily militarized. Checkpoints are everywhere, manned by nervous, trigger-happy soldiers.
He'd be shot at any moment.
Exactly. And here is a civilian, a local headmaster, making a grueling, highly dangerous journey across a war-torn country to barge into the headquarters of a notoriously tough military commander.
He walks in, bypasses the battalion commanders who are terrorizing his home, and demands that Colonel Obasanjo get his troops in line and mandate the humane treatment of the civilians in Ofudoplan. To stand in front of a wartime colonel and demand accountability requires a spine of absolute steel.
It was an act of extraordinary selfless courage. He was putting his life on the line yet again, not for political gain, but for the fundamental dignity and survival of his people during their darkest hour.
And remarkably, it had an impact. His advocacy caught the attention of the higher-ups, and his bravery during the war cemented his status as the undisputed leader of his people.
He'd passed the ultimate test.
He had. He wasn't just a theorist talking about doing good. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death to protect them. So when the war finally grinds to a halt in 1970 and the nation slowly begins the agonizing process of rebuilding, it sets the stage for the next massive chapter in his life.
So we move forward to 1976. The political landscape is shifting again. Following the assassination of General Murtala Muhammad, General Olusegun Obasanjo, the very same man FOA had confronted in Port Harcourt, is now the military head of state.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. Obasanjo initiates a formal transition program designed to terminate military rule and return Nigeria to a constitutional democratic government.
During this post-war period, FOA had briefly relocated to Kano State in the north to work. But as the democratic structures start reforming, his old political allies reach out. They know they need a man of his unassailable character to help rebuild the shattered local governments.
They convinced him that his service was urgently required back home. In September 1976, he resigned from his position in Kano, returned to Ikom, and immediately entered the contest for the caretaker chairmanship of the Ikom local government in February 1977.
Keep in mind, he had been living hundreds of miles away in Kano for 7 years. She had only been back in Ikom for 5 months. But the voters hadn't forgotten the man who guided the troops to liberate them, or the man who traveled to Port Harcourt to stop their abuse. He won the election for caretaker chairman effortlessly.
And he didn't stop there. As the military's transition program matured into what would become the Second Republic in 1979, FOA fully re-entered party politics.
Right.
He joined the Nigeria People's Party, the NPP, emerging as the state vice chairman, once again working alongside his old friend, Matthew Mbu.
He ran for the office of substantive chairman of the Ikom Local Government Council under the NPP banner. And despite facing formidable opposition from rival political parties, he won again.
He was now officially at the helm. He held the substantive chairmanship for 6 years, right up until the military intervened again in 1983. Unbiased historians and local observers universally refer to these 6 years as the undisputed golden age of the ICOM local government area.
This is the moment in the story I've been waiting for. For decades, he's been preaching this Platonian and Aristotelian philosophy of benevolent leadership.
Yeah.
Now he finally has the power. He has a municipal budget, the executive authority, and a mandate. What does he actually do with it?
He fundamentally transformed the region's infrastructure and its economic destiny. To understand his strategy, you have to look at ICOM's geography. It possessed immense agricultural potential. It was rich in cocoa, tubers, bananas, plantains, and highly valuable timber.
But economic potential is meaningless if you can't transport your goods to market.
Exactly.
You can grow all the cocoa in the world, but if your farmers are stuck behind a muddy, impassable bush path, they're going to stay poor. FOA realized that infrastructure was the key to economic determinism.
He aggressively pursued infrastructure connectivity. He successfully campaigned and lobbied to ensure that the proposed Katsina Ala to Agoja Express Highway was extended all the way to Ikom.
Which was a big deal.
Oh, massive. It was a massive logistical achievement because it created a direct paved link between the northeastern part of Nigeria and the southeastern agricultural belt.
And he looked beyond national borders, too. He fought against immense bureaucratic impediments to push through the construction of the Ikom Express Road, which provided a direct, paved trade route linking Nigeria to the neighboring country of Cameroon.
On a local level, he initiated the construction of vital feeder roads and linking bridges that finally opened up the deeply rural, previously inaccessible towns in the Ntun and Bokiland areas. He effectively positioned Ikom as the primary commercial and agricultural hub in the state, second only to the capital city of Calabar.
Building international highways is flashy, legacy cementing work. But what fascinates me about FOA is that he didn't just build shiny monuments and ignore the mundane mechanics of running a city.
No, not at all.
He got his hands dirty fixing the actual municipal plumbing of Ikom. Well, let's look at how he handled the housing crisis.
Right. Because of the new roads and the booming commercial activity, there was a massive influx of civil servants, traders, and workers into Ikom. This population boom immediately exposed a glaring inadequacy in the available housing.
What was the standard solution back then?
The traditional model was for the local council to construct and own government housing for its workers. But FOA recognized that this system was inherently flawed. The government was slow, corruptible, and terrible at property maintenance.
So he takes a shockingly progressive approach. He doesn't ask for a bigger budget to build more government houses. Instead, he abolishes the council housing program entirely.
Yep.
He sells off the existing government-owned houses to the civil servants and the general public.
And he followed that up by implementing a streamlined program to allocate vast tracts of council-owned land to private individuals for independent housing development.
He essentially empowered the citizens to build their own wealth and infrastructure. In the context of 1970s Nigeria, this was a highly radical, forward-thinking policy.
Very much so. It was a precursor to the privatization programs that national governments would adopt decades later.
He's trusting the people to build their own city. And speaking of the unglamorous mechanics of city management, we have to talk about the sanitation issue. Because I had to reread this part of the history twice to fully grasp how horrific the status quo was before FOA stepped in.
You are referring to his absolute abolishment of the night soil man system.
Yes. For anyone listening who doesn't know what a night soil man is, prepare yourself, because it is grim. Prior to FOA's tenure, the vast majority of residential houses in the rapidly growing town of Ikom were built without any latrines or plumbing whatsoever.
Human waste was simply deposited into buckets kept in the compounds. And every single morning, a team of human waste carriers, employees of the local council known as night soil men, had to manually carry these sloshing buckets through the streets and dump them in open landfills on the outskirts of the town.
It's hard to overstate how depraved this system was. From a human dignity standpoint, you are forcing municipal workers to manually carry raw human sewage every day. But from a public health standpoint, it is a ticking time bomb.
Oh, a massive public health hazard.
Carrying open buckets of waste through a crowded tropical town is the exact mechanical formula for sparking catastrophic cholera outbreaks.
It was a primary vector for numerous devastating public health crises in the area. FOA, leaning on his Platonian ideal of using power to remove evils from society, abolished the practice entirely. He didn't just phase it out, he banned it outright.
He instituted a strict municipal mandate requiring every single landlord in Ikom to immediately construct either a deep pit latrine or a modern water system toilet within their compound.
And he made it a matter of zoning law. He strictly prohibited the construction of any future residential buildings in Ikom that did not include proper hygienic latrines.
By doing so, he simultaneously restored human dignity to a class of exploited workers and fundamentally, vastly improved the baseline public health of the entire community.
He also expanded the administrative secretariat, built new primary schools, and funded local health clinics.
But there was one more major crisis he had to solve, one that was a lingering, toxic hangover from the Civil War.
Right. Because Ikom was situated in such a strategic border location, it had remained a heavily militarized garrison town even after the war ended. You had a large, heavily armed battalion of the Nigerian army stationed right smack in the middle of the civilian population center.
And given the horrific history we discussed earlier, the trauma of soldiers brutalizing civilians, that physical proximity was a recipe for disaster.
It was a source of constant fractious military-civilian tension. As the town's population grew and the commercial activity increased, violent, injurious clashes between soldiers and civilians were becoming dangerously frequent.
It's a spatial problem.
Yeah.
You can't have heavily armed soldiers drinking in the same small-town bars as the civilians they used to occupy. FOA recognizes the mechanics of this fiction. He knows he can't order the army to disband, but he can change the geography.
He drafted comprehensive proposals, lobbied the military high command, and successfully allocated a large tract of land far away from the civilian population center near a place called Idor.
So he moved them.
He facilitated the relocation of the military into a newly built specialized barracks out there, effectively physically separating the armed forces from the daily civilian life of Ikom.
So let's look at the scorecard here. He secures international trade routes, builds a web of local feeder roads, privatizes the housing market to solve a real estate crisis, abolishes a horrific sanitation system to stop cholera, and skillfully maneuvers the military out of the city center to prevent civilian casualties.
Quite the resume.
He is wielding immense executive power and managing massive infrastructural budgets. Now, based on everything we know about political history, this is the exact moment where the politician's brother suddenly owns the construction company building the roads, right? This is when he secures a massive, luxurious estate for himself using public funds.
That is the cynical expectation, yeah. But this is where the character of Chief Ogar Awuna truly isolates him from his contemporaries. Consider the housing privatization we just discussed.
Okay.
He personally authorized and oversaw the policy that allowed the public to buy government council houses and acquire prime council land.
And as the chairman, he theoretically had first pick of the best real estate.
Yet, he completely disqualified himself from the process. He did not purchase a single government house. He did not allocate a single plot of prime real estate to himself or his family.
Wow.
Throughout his entire 6-year tenure as the most powerful man in the region, he lived with his family in a modest, rented residence.
He didn't even own the roof over his head while he was building the city.
The only perk of office he utilized, aside from the deep satisfaction of elevating his community, was a standard Peugeot 504 car provided by the government for his official duties.
Unbelievable.
As the historical observers noted, for FOA to love his people through service was an infinitely greater ability than to rule over them or extract from them.
And the absolute undeniable proof of this incorruptibility was revealed in 1983.
Yeah.
Because just as quickly as the Second Republic had blossomed, it was violently shattered.
The historical accounts refer to it as the broken china. The democratic experiment collapsed again.
Another coup.
Yes. Under the guise that the country's public institutions and hospitals had degraded into mere consulting clinics, a military junta led by General Muhammadu Buhari and Brigadier Tunde Idi Agbon and later General Sani Abacha announced the total sacking of the Second Republic.
The military adventurer struck again, suspending the Constitution and dissolving all democratic offices. FOA, along with every other elected official in the country, was removed from power overnight.
The military forcefully accused the political class of rampant corruption, catastrophic leadership failure, and looting the national treasury.
And frankly, for many of the politicians, the accusations were entirely accurate.
Oh, very much so. The political class had, by and large, plundered the state. But the military solution wasn't much better. They lacked the nuanced skill required to navigate the complex ship of state, and simply blundered along, accelerating Nigeria's path toward failed statehood.
But what fascinates me is the immediate reaction of the political elites when they lost power. You would think they would be ashamed or perhaps go into hiding.
On the contrary, finding themselves suddenly out of work and terrified of losing their access to state resources, the vast majority of the ousted political class engaged in a frenzied, humiliating scramble for public sinecures.
They shamelessly fell over themselves, lobbying and begging for appointments to serve under the very military generals who had just destroyed their democracy. They cared only about maintaining their proximity to the treasury.
But not FOA. FOA fundamentally viewed political power as a sacred temporary trust. He never viewed himself as a ruler. He operated strictly on the principle of primi inter pares. He was simply a peer, a first among equals, who happened to be holding the pen for a few years.
It was conceptually inconceivable to him that public endowment should ever be converted for personal use.
Right.
Which brings us back to the staggering paradox we opened the show with. When the music stopped and the coup happened, the men who had been looting the state retreated to their mansions. FOA, the man who built the infrastructure, walked away with absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
He had spent his entire life in public service, and he had no house, no personal car, and no hidden bank accounts.
He refused to compromise his Aristotelian principles by begging a military junta for a job. So this incredibly powerful former chairman, the man who negotiated international expressways, quietly returned to his village.
Back to the farm.
Yes. To feed his maturing family, he went back to manual subsistence farming. And to make ends meet, he took a humble job as a classroom teacher at Velos Commercial College.
It is incredibly poetic. The man who was universally beloved and called the teacher in the morning of his life reverted to being just a teacher in the twilight of his years.
It's full circle.
But I have to imagine the psychological whiplash of that transition, to go from managing massive international budgets and commanding an executive staff to literally planting yams in the dirt just to survive, while the corrupt politicians around you continue to thrive. How does a person not become consumed by a toxic, paralyzing bitterness?
Well, it requires a level of psychological resilience and internal peace that very few human beings possess. But FOA did not view his lack of wealth as a failure. He viewed it as the ultimate proof of his integrity. And importantly, his community recognized this.
They didn't mock his poverty, they revered it.
Because they knew exactly why he was poor. He was poor because he didn't steal from them. And he used this period of semi-retirement to reconnect deeply with the grassroots level of his community. He now had the time to travel to all the rural towns like Okosora and Egbaragba towns that were now easily accessible, specifically because of the roads he had built.
He's literally walking on his own legacy.
He sat with the clan heads, the local elites, and the youths. Even though he held no official office, his counsel was actively sought on almost all matters of local governance and conflict resolution.
That speaks volumes about his character.
It does. The police force, recognizing his unparalleled ability to build consensus, appointed him as the chairman of the Ikom Local Government Police Public Relationship Committee, a vital mediation role he held until his death. By protocol, he was constantly expected to attend functions and play host to any visiting dignitaries to Ikom.
It's beautiful, but it also carries a profound sadness. Society finally gave him his ultimate validation, not when he controlled the municipal budget, but when he was a part-time teacher with nothing left to his name but his unassailable reputation.
That validation became official in 1988. The Traditional Rulers Council, under the leadership of the paramount ruler of Ikom, the Venerable Ndoma Egba, convened to honor him.
They officially conferred upon him the unique chieftaincy title of Ntun onimono one of Ikom, the chief doer of the good things in Ikom, the king of humanitarianism.
It is the ultimate vindication of his Aristotelian belief that goodness is defined solely by the actions you take to help others.
But the fact that a man of this caliber was pushed to the margins of power while corrupt opportunists controlled the nation asks a very dark question about the trajectory of the country. And unfortunately, that systemic decay leads us directly into the final heartbreaking chapter of FOA's life.
Right.
Because you can walk away from a broken system with your integrity intact, but eventually the collapse of that system catches up to everyone.
The tragedy begins with a seemingly innocuous, mundane event. It was a hot afternoon in March 1990. FOA was sitting on his veranda, engaging in his lifelong habit of reading a book.
He had spread out some melon seeds on the veranda to dry in the sun. As he was reading, a stray hen wandered up and started pecking at the seeds. FOA picked up a small stick to chase the bird away.
But as he made a sudden forceful motion with his arm to throw the stick, he heard a loud, sickening crack in his bone. The pain was so intense and immediate that he collapsed to the ground.
His family rushed him to the general hospital in Ikom. The doctors conducted a preliminary examination and concluded it was a routine bone fracture. They set the arm, put it in a cast, and discharged him, assuring him that a simple fracture like that would heal completely within 6 months.
But the mechanics of the healing process completely failed. 6 months went by, then 8 months, with no tangible improvement. The pain remained, and the bone refused to knit back together.
So they had to escalate it.
Finally, in October 1991, realizing they were out of their depth, the local hospital referred him to the specialized National Orthopedic Hospital in Enugu.
And this is where the medical reality becomes devastating. The specialists in Enugu spent 2 months conducting extensive medical examinations and attempting various treatments. They finally discovered the underlying mechanical reason why the bone was failing to mend.
The marrow inside the bone was highly cancerous.
The diagnosis of bone marrow cancer. The doctors immediately prescribed complex bone marrow surgery as the only viable course of action. But to even prepare his body to survive the trauma of the surgery, he urgently needed a blood transfusion.
His second son, Isaac, the very same son he had proudly named Adesaba decades earlier in honor of Pan-African unity, was by his side at the hospital. Isaac was a match, and he immediately donated the necessary blood for the transfusion.
The blood transfusion is successful, but then the institutional rot of the Nigerian state steps in and turns a medical crisis into a fatal tragedy. I want to go back to that quote from the 1983 military coup. General Sani Abacha justified overthrowing the democratic government by publicly declaring that the country's hospitals had become, quote, mere consulting clinics, devoid of drugs or equipment.
Yes, that was the grand justification for military rule. They promised to fix the decay. But almost a decade of supposedly corrective military dictatorship later, the reality was starkly different.
The public health infrastructure hadn't just stagnated, it had completely collapsed.
When the doctors at the National Orthopedic Hospital went to prep FOA for his surgery, they realized they needed to administer a specific regimen of chemotherapeutic injections and drugs.
But when they checked the pharmacy of this premier national hospital, it was completely empty. They were entirely out of stock of basic life-saving chemotherapy medication.
The state hospital had nothing to offer him. So the burden fell entirely on his family. His son Isaac was forced to scramble through the city, visiting private, unregulated pharmacies outside the hospital system, desperately trying to purchase the necessary chemotherapeutic injections out of pocket.
He manages to buy the drugs privately and brings them back to the hospital. But this is where the lack of institutional oversight becomes lethal. We don't know if the privately purchased drugs were counterfeit, improperly stored, or administered incorrectly by an underfunded hospital staff.
But on the 12th of December 1991, the doctors injected FOA with those privately sourced drugs.
His body reacted catastrophically to the injection. Almost immediately, he began to convulse violently. His system crashed, he slipped into a deep coma, and he passed away shortly after. He never even made it to the operating table for the bone marrow surgery.
It is a chilling, infuriating conclusion. The historical commentary on this moment is brutal but accurate. For FOA, the country's hospitals had degraded from being mere consulting clinics under the politicians to becoming literal shortcuts to the next world under the military regime.
It is the ultimate damning indictment of a system hollowed out by corruption.
It really is.
I find this part of the story so deeply enraging. Think about the mechanics of his entire life. Here is a man who spent decades painstakingly building infrastructure. He abolished the night soil system specifically to stop preventable diseases and promote public health.
He fought corruption at every turn, refusing to enrich himself.
And in the end, he dies a painful, unnecessary death, specifically because the national infrastructure is broken, the public health system is bankrupt, and corruption has hollowed out the very state he sacrificed everything to build. It forces a really dark question. Was all his high-minded philosophy, all his Aristotelian sacrifice, ultimately for nothing? Did the broken system win?
It is a completely natural reaction to feel that the systemic rot defeated him in the end. When a good man dies because of bad governance, it feels like a victory for the corrupt.
Right.
But to answer the question of whether it was for nothing, we have to look past the tragedy of his death and examine the durability of his legacy. We have to look at why we are still analyzing his life today, decades after he was entombed in the Okosora village square.
FOA was a man of incredibly humble birth. He didn't have an independent fortune to buy loyalty. He completely lacked the kind of loud, divisive demagoguery that typically propels politicians to the top in fractured societies.
He didn't rise to power through the back doors of a rotten, rigged political process. He rose to become a preeminent leader through the sheer, undeniable power of his intellect, his administrative genius, and the unyielding strength of his moral convictions.
He was a first-rate administrator and a master consensus builder. He proved, through both his rhetoric and his tangible administrative actions, that a community can only truly thrive if it recruits into its service people driven by the right motives, people who are completely untrammeled by the pervasive rule of mediocrity and greed.
And this brings us directly back to our mission for this deep dive, specifically speaking to the younger generation of the Ofatop and Ikom people. You are coming of age in a modern era that is still overflowing with cynical politics, ethnic division, and self-serving leaders.
In that context, the life of FOA isn't just a dry history lesson. It is a highly specific operational blueprint. He proved, mechanically, that true leadership isn't defined by what you can extract from the public treasury. It is defined by the infrastructure, the dignity, and the security you can provide for your people.
He achieved what he did because he consciously chose to approach human nature from the golden side. He believed in the Platonian ideal of elevating people through education and fairness, and by doing so, he consistently drew the absolute best out of a deeply fractured community.
And they gave him their hearts in return. Not because he was their sovereign ruler holding a gun to their heads, but because of who he authentically was at his core, the teacher. He earned the title Ntun onimono of Ikom because he didn't just theorize about progressive humanity, he actually did the good things. He took Aristotle's philosophy and built roads, schools, and health mandates out of it.
Which leaves us with a final, complex thought for you to explore on your own. The life of Chief Ogar Awuna definitively proves that a single individual of unyielding character can spark a localized golden age, even while operating within a deeply flawed, corrupt national system.
But it raises a much harder question about the future. If a nation's core institutions continue to be eroded by neglect and graft, does the legacy of a righteous leader eventually inspire the systemic, mechanical reform needed to save the country? Or does that legacy only survive in the myths, the chieftaincy titles, and the stories we pass down to the next generation to make ourselves feel better?
When you look at the mechanics of your own community today, are you waiting for the broken system to somehow magically fix itself? Or are you studying the blueprint left behind, ready to step up and become the next doer of good things?
Remember that paradox we started with, the powerful politician who returns home with nothing but his absolute integrity. It turns out when the military tanks roll in and the systems collapse, your integrity is the only currency that retains its value. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into a truly extraordinary life. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.